On February the 22nd, 1942, a strike force of British, Australian, American, and Dutch ships clashed with an Imperial Japanese Navy cruiser squadron off the coast of Sumatra. The engagement, known as the Battle of the Java Sea, was a decisive victory for the Japanese, resulting in the loss of 2,300 Allied sailors and 5 ships, including the light cruiser HMS Exeter. 65 years after the battle, a team of exploration divers rediscovered the wreck sitting in 200 feet of water, 90 miles northwest of WWIII Island. But when another team surveyed the wreck site 10 years later, they made a shocking discovery. The wreck had completely vanished, leaving only a 500-foot-long depression in the seabed. The disappearance was not the work of supernatural forces, but of Indonesian illegal salvagers, who, armed with nothing more than small boats and air compressors, had managed to strip away the nearly 10,000-ton hull in less than a decade. While warships contain huge quantities of bronze, brass, copper, and other non-ferrous metals that can fetch high prices on the scrap market, the complete disappearance of Exeter's entire hull was baffling, leading some to speculate that it had been harvested for the little-known but highly lucrative market for low background steel. But was it really? And how did this bizarre demand for battleship steel come to be? To begin with, low background metals, metals which emit no ionizing radiation. The term generally refers to metal produced prior to July 16, 1945. On that day at 5:29 a.m., the world's first atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity, was detonated near Alamogordo in the New Mexico desert. This event changed the world forever, not only military and politically, but chemically, releasing into the atmosphere dozens of radioactive isotopes that had never existed before in nature, such as plutonium-239, strontium-90, cesium-137, and technetium-99. Over the next 35 years, the United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China would conduct over 1,000 atmospheric nuclear tests, spreading huge quantities of these isotopes over every corner of the globe. And as the standard Bessemer process for making steel involves blowing atmospheric air through molten iron, these isotopes also found their way into nearly every piece of steel produced after 1945. For most applications, this contamination is not a problem, as the radiation emitted by regular steel is far below regular background levels. But for certain pieces of highly sensitive scientific equipment, even this low-level radiation can generate unacceptable interference. One example of such equipment are whole-body counting rooms, devices used in hospitals and nuclear power plants to measure the amount of radioactive material a person's body has absorbed. To prevent background radiation from interfering with measurements, such rooms must be encased in thick metal shielding, but because of the aforementioned radioisotope contamination, only steel produced prior to 1945 can be used. From the 1950s through the 1980s, when most of these rooms were constructed, the cheapest and most readily available source of low background steel was from decommissioned warships built prior to 1945. For example, hull plates from USS Indiana, commissioned in 1942 and scrapped in 1962, were used to build steel rooms for whole-body counters at the Illinois VA Hospital and the Utah Medical Center. Even shipwrecks have been salvaged for their low background steel, most notably the remains of the World War I German High Seas Fleet scuttled at Scapa Flow in 1919. In 1974, hull plates from the SMS Kronprinz Wilhelm were used to build a whole-body counter room at a Scottish hospital, and it is rumored that steel from the SMS Mark Graf was used in radiation detectors on Explorer 1, America's first satellite, and the Voyager 1 and 2 space probes, making it the only battleship to make it into space. However, NASA has never been able to confirm this. Another commonly sought low background metal is lead, which is not only susceptible to contamination by atmospheric radionucleotides, but can also be naturally contaminated with the radioactive isotope lead-210. In the 1980s, electronics manufacturers discovered that stray radioactive emissions from regular lead were affecting the manufacture of microchips. In order to obtain sufficiently low background lead, the manufacturers proceeded to dismantle 400-year-old medieval stained glass windows and swap out the old lead for new. More recently, in 2010, the Italian National Institute of Nuclear Physics in Rome needed shielding for its cryogenic underground observatory for rare events, or CORE, an experiment for detecting ghostly subatomic particles called neutrinos. Wanting only the most inert shielding, the institute obtains permission from the National Archaeological Museum in Cagliari to melt down 270 lead ingots from an ancient Roman shipwreck that sank off the coast of Sardinia almost 2,000 years ago. Experiments at Los Alamos Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico have also used lead pipes pulled up from Boston's old plumbing system, while Duke University and the University of Chicago has used lead ballast from the 300-year-old Spanish galleon San Ignacio. Unsurprisingly, given the extreme rarity of these sources, low background lead can command premium prices, with ingots from the San Ignacio selling for $33 per kilogram, nearly 12 times the market price for regular lead. And not all low background lead that shows up on the market has such clear provenance, raising concerns that some of it may have been illegally salvaged from archaeologically priceless shipwrecks. Which brings us back to the question, was HMS Exeter salvaged for low background steel? Most likely the answer is no, as the demand for low background steel has actually all but dried up in recent years. In 1963, the US, USSR, and Great Britain signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, banning all atmospheric nuclear tests. Though France and China continued atmospheric testing until 1980, since then, radionucleotide contamination in the atmosphere has fallen to only 1/30th of 1963 levels. Steelmaking has also largely turned away from the Bessemer process in favor of the basic oxygen process, which uses uncontaminated pure oxygen instead of atmospheric air. Advances in electronics have also allowed scientific apparatus to compensate for stray radioactive emissions, meaning that for all but the most sensitive instruments like neutrino detectors, low background steel is no longer necessary. In all likelihood then, HMS Exeter was cut apart for ordinary scrap steel. However, the radioactive contamination of the atmosphere has had at least one positive effect. By studying the isotope composition of wine, forensic chemists are able to tell whether a certain bottle was produced after 1945, allowing for the identification of counterfeit vintages, thus proving that every mushroom cloud has a silver lining. And now for a bonus fact. Speaking of battleships and steel, it turns out the Slinky, yes, the once popular toy, graced the world with its presence thanks to battleships. How? In 1943, Richard James, a marine engineer in a Philadelphia shipyard, was working at his desk developing a special meter designed to monitor the horsepower output on naval battleships. This meter required the use of special springs in order to stabilize the instrument in rough seas. At a certain point, James accidentally knocked a length of one of the springs he was working with off his desk. To his amazement, the spring fell from his position on the desk and then walked from that point to a stack of books and eventually onto the floor where it coiled back up. Richard rushed home and told his wife about what happened and said, "I think if I got the right property of steel and the right tension, I could make it walk." He went on to tell her he thought he could make a child's toy out of it. After some time, Richard made a few prototypes, which he let children in his neighborhood play with in order to gauge the response, which ended up being overwhelmingly positive. His wife, Betty, then searched for a name for this new toy. After searching through the dictionary for hours, she finally settled on slinky, meaning sinuous and slender, and had previously been used mainly as an adjective to describe women or clothing. With a $500 loan, about $7,000 today, to pay a company to manufacture a small quantity of slinkies, in 1945, Richard and Betty made an attempt to sell the toy in a retail outlet store in Philadelphia. The retail store agreed to put 400 slinkies on display for the upcoming Christmas shoppers. After a few days and no sales, Richard began to fear the worst. He decided to go down to the store and display what the toy could do. His wife Betty agreed to meet up with him later that night. When she arrived, she saw a line of customers purchasing every last slinky. All 400 of them sold in 90 minutes. That said, while sales quickly surged by the late 1950s, things weren't so rosy. Finally, in 1960, Richard James left his struggling company, which was deeply in debt, and moved to Bolivia, where he became a missionary. When Betty refused to go with him, he told her she could have the company, and he didn't care what she did with it. Betty then took over management and proved to be a much better businessman than her ex-husband. The company expanded greatly under her leadership, and to date has sold over 300 million slinkies. For her contributions making the Slinky one of the best-selling toys in the world, Betty James was inducted into the Toy Industry Hall of Fame in 2001. She died in 2008 at the age of 90. Her ex-husband Richard James died just 14 years after moving to Bolivia in 1974. While performing at the Wood Green Empire in London in 1918, one of the most famous and successful magicians in the world, Chinese illusionist Chung Ling was unfortunately killed attempting to catch a bullet. The fact that he got shot was only part of what astonished the audience that day. You see, directly after, Su, a man who'd spent his entire career working in silence or through translators and long claimed he understood no language except Chinese, exclaimed in perfect English, "I've been shot, bring down the curtain. As it turns out, Chung Ling-Soo wasn't a Chinese illusionist at all, but an American man who'd lifted his entire gimmick wholesale from an actual Chinese magician and somehow had gotten away with it for nearly 2 decades. As if that wasn't impressive enough, at one point he even convinced the general public that the man he copied was the actual imposter, seeing said individual, Chinese magician Ching Ling-Fu, more or less disappear from the history books after that. And in today's video, well, this is the bizarre story of Chung Ling-Soo, or as his parents named him, William Ellsworth Robinson. Born in Westchester County, New York in 1861, Robinson was fascinated by magic from a young age, and his studious nature eventually saw him becoming proficient in a number of magical skills by his early teens. By age 14, Robinson was sufficiently adept at the magical arts as to work as a performer on the vaudeville circuit, earning a decent living with his illusions and tricks. Did this guy look Chinese? I mean, I feel like I know the difference. Well, someone's done an Instagram page with him. Let me see. He does not look Chinese. He does not look Chinese. He's just wearing Chinese clothes. What's going on? Do people not know what Chinese people look like? A consummate performer of magic by all accounts, Robinson's weakness was his stage persona, with the magician being said to lack the, shall we say, razzmatazz of a seasoned magician or illusionist. Robinson attempted to address this by billing himself as Robinson, the Man of Mystery, but still found himself unable to land the headlining role in any vaudeville show due to his near total lack of charisma or charm. So he decided to become Chinese. Frustrated in what who doesn't even speak English. Frustrated in what would become his modus operandi later in life, he thus decided to simply steal the gimmick of a better magician, specifically the German-born magician Max Orsinger. Famous in his native Germany and throughout Europe, Orsinger regularly performed under the stage name Ben Ali Bey and styled himself as a vaguely Asian occultist and master of the black arts. This more or less allowed Orsinger to have a bit of mystique around him on stage, but without needing to talk. Robinson thus began billing himself as Ben Ali Bey sometime in 1887 and just copied the mostly silent act. As many of you sometimes point out, be like me being like, hi, Vsauce Michael here. It just wouldn't work. I mean, maybe it would. On that note, not content with just stealing the on-stage persona Orsinger had spent his entire life crafting, Robinson also shamelessly lifted the German illusionist's greatest trick, making objects seemingly appear from thin air. For anyone curious about how the trick was performed, Robinson would stand on a very dark and poorly lit stage wearing all white, while an assistant covered in dark cloth would pull various objects out of their pockets and wave them around to make it look to those in the audience like they were flying. Really? Magic back in the day? Not quite as good as it is today. Over the next few years, Robinson continued to style himself as a foreign illusionist and quietly developed his skills as a magician while opening for more famous magicians such as Harry Keller and Alexander Herman. While studying under the former, he changed his act and race yet again when he heard the magician lament that Egyptian mystics weren't as impressive as Indian fakirs. Dutifully, Robinson altered his act and began billing himself as Nana Sahib, the East Indian necromancer. Likewise, while studying under Herman, Robinson learned that the magician favored neither Egyptian nor Indian magic and was actually a fan of the illusions performed by conjurers in Constantinople. As a result, Nana Sahib became Abdul Khan. In each case, Robinson committed to the role as best he could, adopting the stereotypical garb and look associated with the culture he was trying to mimic, and invariably he would remain silent, save for orders barked to assistants on stage in broken English and his best attempt at an appropriate accent. Still, Robinson was unable to escape the shadows of the great illusionists he was opening for, and found himself unable to secure a gig as a headlining act. But this all changed when the magician met Ching Ling-Fu, a master magician who'd been the personal illusionist to the Empress of China, because apparently that's a thing. Before traveling the world, Ching Ling-Fu, real name Zhu Lianko, first met Robinson in 1898 when the latter was still studying under Alexander Herman. During this initial meeting, Robinson observed Herman performing the Chinese linking rings trick to Fu as a demonstration of his skill and as a nod to China's critical role in the development of magic as a performing art. Fu reportedly walked away from this meeting unimpressed, and the next time the pair met, Fu is said to have performed a far more elaborate version of Herman's routine routine before throwing the rings aside and pulling a goldfish bowl out of thin air while breathing fire. Naturally, given all we've said about him so far, you'll be unsurprised to learn that this all inspired Robinson to adopt an almost identical persona to that of Ching Fu. It seems dangerous to hang around with this guy because eventually you'll meet him and he'll be you. Despite this, the feud between the two wouldn't begin in earnest for another 2 years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To begin with, when Fu first arrived in the States to promote his act, he made a $1,000, about $31,000 a day, standing bet with the entire American magical community that nobody would be able to replicate his most famous illusion, the water bowl trick. In a nutshell, the trick would see Fu wave around a simple piece of cloth from which it'd produce a comically large bowl of water. Fu would then place this bowl on a table, which he'd then cover with the cloth before dramatically removing it to reveal the water had been replaced by a small boy. In some versions of the trick, Fu would produce a smaller bowl containing a fish. However, in each case, the giant bowl would be filled to the brim, all making the illusion seem impossible. Again, for anyone curious, the bowl was simply hidden below Fu's flowing oriental robes, and he used his finely honed sleight of hand skills to make it look like he was actually pulling from the folds of the cloth. Robinson, who, as you probably guessed by now, was quite adept at copying the tricks of others, managed to figure out how to perform the trick after observing Fu do it several times, and thus tried to take the Chinese illusionist up on his offer. For reasons that aren't entirely clear, though, Fu refused to meet with Robinson or honor the terms of the bet that he had made, something that understandably annoyed Robinson greatly. It's like, revenge, stealing his identity. In 1900, Robinson spied his chance for revenge in the form of an open call from a theatre in France that was looking for an act similar to Fu's, only cheaper. Already familiar with Fu's routine and evidently not concerned with the ethics of outright stealing the tricks and stage persona of other magicians, Robinson took the gig and traveled to Europe. Once there, he bought some old Chinese robes and did his best to alter his appearance to be stereotypically Chinese. To really sell people on his ethnicity, Robinson also pretty much stopped talking to anyone publicly outside of his assistant, Sui Sin, who he billed as his wife, though in truth had left his real wife at home after they had a kid and she couldn't travel with him anymore. However, owing to being Catholic, he decided not to get officially divorced and just shacked up with Sui Sin for the rest of his life. As will probably not come as a surprise, Sui Sin was also not Chinese, rather an American woman called Olive Path, who likewise attempted to modify her appearance as best she could to appear Chinese. Again, they didn't do a good job. Other than this dude's clothes, he looks fully Caucasian. Fully. In any event, while performing in France, Robinson honed his skills to the point that he was eventually linked to headline shows in London. It was here that the magician decided to throw all pretense out of the window and began billing himself as Chung Ling Su. Under this new guise, Robinson achieved extreme success in London, becoming by all accounts one of the highest paid magicians in the world during the height of his fame. During this time, Robinson committed somewhat admirably to the role of Chung Ling Su, never once breaking character in public as far as any primary accounts of him reveal. This said, while it's often claimed that nobody knew one of the most famous magicians in the world was really a white guy from America called William Robinson pretending to be Chinese, if you do some digging, it would appear pretty much everyone in the magical community knew his secret, but being a rather tight-knit group about secrets, nobody seems to have been willing to blow the whistle. That said, there is a 1902 article in Magic magazine that openly acknowledges that the two men were one and the same. In any event, for 4 years, Robinson performed throughout Europe as Chung Ling Su without incident, until 1904 when Ching Ling Fu's troupe of magicians and Chinese acrobats arrived in London to play their rather popular show. This almost immediately caused a stir amongst Londoners, as there was understandably confusion about which man was which given the similarity of their names and the fact that their acts were basically identical. This was all made worse by the fact that the theatres Chung Ling Su and Ching Ling Fu were set to perform at were only about 100 feet apart. Incidentally, as a brief aside, at around the same time Chung Ling Su and Ching Ling Fu were performing at neighbouring theatres in London, there were at least 2 other Chinese magicians performing similar acts in the city. We only mention this because these 2 magicians billed themselves as Peepa Poo and Golden Poo, respectively. Oh, that's a good name. What's your name? Golden Poo. You could just call me Golden Going back to Fu and Su, naturally when Fu found out about Su and his copycat act, he was rightfully incensed at Robinson's gall, and sensing the opportunity for a juicy story, the Weekly Dispatch newspaper encouraged the magician to challenge Robinson to a magical duel. Fu agreed and openly challenged his rival to replicate 10 of his tricks at the newspaper's office, a challenge Robinson happily agreed to. Or so it would seem, because it's noted that Fu was so enraged by Robinson's appropriation of Chinese magic that he added a second stipulation to to his challenge, that Robinson prove before members of the Chinese legation that he is a Chinaman. That's not going to go well. This is something Robinson obviously could not do. Robinson and the press decided to heroically ignore this part of the challenge, and mention of it was conveniently left out of the press coverage of their feud. This so annoyed Fu that he didn't turn up to the challenge in protest. This was something Robinson capitalized on by publicly declaring himself the winner, which was then gleefully reported on by the media, who joked that Fu had turned up but had been made to disappear by Su. Hilarious. Fu's reputation was so badly damaged by this amongst Londoners that many assumed that he was ripping off Su, and his previously wildly popular show Elsewhere flopped completely in London. He was cancelled in under a month. Su's copycat act, in contrast, was a hit and endured for months in London. His legitimacy now cemented in the eyes of the public and the media, Robinson then spent the next 14 years performing as Chung Ling Su, becoming immensely wealthy in the process. Ching Ling Fu, on the other hand, largely disappeared from the public record after his feud from Robinson. Thus, funnily enough, as the former news accounts alleged, Su really did make Fu disappear. Of course, as mentioned in the beginning, Robinson did eventually get a comeuppance of sorts when he died trying to perform the so-called condemned to death by the Boxers magic trick, with a name referencing the Chinese uprising known as the Boxer Rebellion. After Su's death, how he'd done the trick in the past was officially revealed to the wider public, as was the fact that he was actually an American. As to the trick, he would have random members of the audience mark bullets. Muzzle-loaded guns would then be loaded with said bullets and fired at the magician by assistants at point-blank range. After, he would show that he'd managed to catch the bullet, sometimes dramatically in his hands or other times just in his teeth. He would also, of course, display the markings for all to see. In truth, he would simply use sleight of hand to palm the marked bullets, and different ones would be loaded. As to the guns, they were specifically designed so that the main loaded gunpowder would not fire, but rather a chamber below would fire a blank charge. This ensured that the bullet that was loaded would never exit the gun, but it would all appear as if the gun had fired normally. As to what went wrong, after the performances, the bullets and main charge would need to be extracted, and rather than doing something simple like firing the gun normally, Su would simply dismantle part of the gun and remove them manually. The issue was that it appears some residual gunpowder built up, and on the fateful night in question, flashed after the blank charge went off. This in turn set off the main charge and fired the bullet. Robinson died a short while later, his last known words on stage, and the subsequent news accounts pulling the curtain on arguably his greatest illusion of all, the fact that he wasn't even Chinese. In the video today, we're answering a viewer question because Nick R asks us, is it true there was once a girl with no vagina who got pregnant after giving oral sex and then getting stabbed in the stomach? Alright, Nick. Well, just to start off, we got to say that we were really pretty damn skeptical on this one just from the sound of it. I mean, it's got urban legend written all over it. However, upon researching it just a little bit, we actually found a paper published in the very reputable British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 1988 titled Oral Conception Impregnation via the Proximal Gastrointestinal Tract in a Patient with an Aplastic Distal Vagina. Case report. So, it would appear that unless the author was simply writing up a very detailed practical joke and then managed to somehow slip it by the editors of that esteemed journal, then it very well might actually be true. So, when you were taught that a woman can't get pregnant from engaging in oral sex, well, apparently it's actually theoretically possible given the right set of circumstances. That is why a 15-year-old girl in the small African country of Lesotho who was born without a vagina and who had engaged only in fellatio with her boyfriend had doctors puzzled when she gave birth to a healthy son. The young girl, whose name is not given in the case report, arrived at a local hospital with all the signs of a woman in labor. Upon examination, doctors found no vagina, only a shallow skin dimple. Regardless of how the baby was conceived, it was ready to emerge from the womb. With no birth canal, the baby's only option of escape was cesarean section. Doctors delivered the baby via C-section, weighing at 2.8 kilograms or 6.17 pounds, and then set out to solve the mystery of his conception. As they say in the case study, after performing the emergency C-section, while closing the abdominal wall, curiosity could not be contained any longer and the patient was interviewed with the help of a sympathetic nursing sister. The whole story did not become completely clear during that day, but with some subsequent inquiries, the whole saga emerged. The girl's hospital records showed that only 278 days earlier, about 9 months, she had arrived at the hospital with knife wounds to her stomach. So, how did she get these? Well, according to the case study, the patient was well aware of the fact that she had no vagina and she had started oral experiments after disappointing attempts at conventional intercourse. Just before she was stabbed in the abdomen, she had practiced fellatio with her new boyfriend and was caught in the act by her former lover. The fight with knives ensued. She had never had a period, and there was no trace of lochia after the cesarean section. She had been worried about the increase in her abdominal size, but could not believe she was pregnant, although it had crossed her mind more often as her girth increased and as people around her suggested that she was pregnant. She did recall several episodes of lower abdominal pain during the previous year. While performing surgery to repair the stab wounds, doctors found 2 holes that opened the girl's stomach to her abdominal cavity. They also noticed that the girl arrived at the hospital with an empty stomach, resulting in the absence of large amounts of stomach acid or any other food matter. Thus, it is thought that in the most unlikely of circumstances, that the sperm in the girl's stomach gained access to the girl's reproductive organs through her injured gastrointestinal tract. Even given this access, it's still a long way for the sperm to travel, so how is it theorized that they survived the journey? Well, in the first place, her stomach was mostly empty of stomach acid, and sperm is protected from non-favorable environments by a nourishing medium called ejaculate. This ejaculate would have helped protect this girl's new lover's sperm from the remaining stomach acid, among other hazards. The stabbing also seems to have happened almost immediately after the girl ingested the sperm, so it needn't have survived in the stomach for very long. And don't forget about the strength of numbers. Sperm don't travel alone. Even if 90% of them don't survive the beginning of the journey, you're still left with millions of the tiny little swimmers, and you only need one. Dr. Peter Schlegel, chairman of urology at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Weill Cornell Medical Center in New York, weighed in on the issue and pointed out that sperm can normally swim up and out of the reproductive cavity and into the abdominal cavity. The sperm are naturally there at times, and eggs are naturally there, he says. Eggs are released from the ovary, and they sort of dance around before they are taken up by the fallopian tube. In fact, getting pregnant as the result of sperm originating in your abdomen is possible enough that in the 1980s, during the early days of fertility treatments, doctors performed a procedure called DIPI, direct intraperitoneal insemination, during which they injected sperm into the lower abdomen, hoping that it would find its way to an egg. What makes this set of circumstances even more amazing is that the doctors thought that this was the girl's first or nearly first ovulation, otherwise one would expect that inspiciated blood in the uterus and salpinges would have made fertilization difficult. So, in the end, the big question is, well, did it really happen? Well, it was published in a reputable journal, and no, it didn't happen on April the 1st, rather it happened in September of 1988. So, we definitely have a young girl with no vagina having a baby. So, aside from immaculate conception, which is ruled out because it's immaculate conception, and also that the father somewhat resembled the baby, the theory listed in the study does seem plausible enough, and it certainly is theoretically possible, as pointed out by many doctors. So, we are going to say that yes, this actually happens, even though we really hesitated to push publish on this one because it just seems like such an urban legend. But you know, similar strange things have happened, such as the somewhat disturbing instance of a 5-year-old girl who gave birth to a healthy child. As you might expect, she holds the record for the youngest person to ever give birth. So if you're wondering how it turned out for the girl who was stabbed in the stomach, who was impoverished and probably would not have been able to support the child had it not been for this bizarre set of circumstances, well, they talk about that in the case study as well. The young mother, her family, and the likely father adapted themselves rapidly to the new situation, and some cattle changed hands to prove that there were no hard feelings. All's well that ends well, we suppose. The US state of Washington, in the American Pacific Northwest, is infamous for its wet weather, with rain falling an average of 150 days a year. In Oakville, a small town of around 700 people, 70 kilometers southwest of Seattle, average rainfall exceeds 100 centimeters per month from October through April, with the driest months typically being July and August. But the summer of 1994 was different. For in August that year, the ever-present grey clouds hovering over Oakville brought not rain, but a scene straight out of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Torrents of strange gelatinous white substance that coated every surface, killed dozens of animals, and made anyone who came into contact with it violently ill. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the bizarre substance evaporated into thin air, leaving a mystery that endures to this day. The Oakville incident began around 3 a.m. on August 7, 1994, as tiny blobs of gelatinous material began falling from the sky. Among the first to witness the strange phenomenon was police officer David Lacey, then on patrol with a colleague. Quote, "We turned our windshield wipers on, and it just started smearing to the point where we could almost not see. And we both looked at each other and said, well, geez, this isn't right. I mean, we're out in the middle of nowhere, basically. Where did this come from?" The substance was very mushy. It's almost like if you had Jell-O in your hands and you could pretty much squish it through your fingers. We did have some bells go off in our hands that basically said, this isn't right, this isn't normal. Meanwhile, residents all over the Oakville area began reporting the same strange substance falling on their properties. Among these was Dottie Hearn, who owned a farm on the outskirts of town. As her daughter, Sonny Barcliff, later recalled, "It looked like hail lying on top of the firewood box and everywhere else. So I just went over and touched it, and it wasn't hail. It was a gelatinous-like material, no colour at all, and about the size of grains of rice. It was literally everywhere, in the grass, on foliage, on my truck window." In all, the blobs fell over an area of around nearly 50 square miles in and around Oakville. But while residents were puzzled by the phenomena, few were overly concerned. That is, until the sickness began. Later in the afternoon, on August the 7th, Officer Lacey suddenly fell seriously ill. I was at the point where I could hardly breathe. I started to put together that possibly whatever the substance was, it made me violently sick like I never had been before, to the point where it just totally shut me down. Meanwhile, Dottie Hearn also suddenly took ill. Shortly after touching the strange substance with her bare hands, she was found by her daughter sprawled on the floor, suffering from severe nausea and vertigo. She was cold, drenched with perspiration. My mum had been vomiting. She had extreme vertigo. She complained that she had difficulty with her vision. Her vision was blurring. Hearn was later taken to hospital, where she was initially diagnosed with Meniere's disease, a disorder of the inner ear. But her daughter was skeptical of the diagnosis, later recalling, "She had extreme vertigo, dizziness, and felt the room was spinning. Those are all symptoms of that disease. However, she also had a fever and other symptoms of infection. She spent 4 days in the hospital." Upon her release, I asked Dr. Little what her discharge diagnosis was. He shrugged his shoulders and said, "I don't know. Some type of virus." She did have a complete recovery after she arrived home and over time. Meniere's disease usually manifests as an ongoing problem, but she never had the symptoms again. For some reason, as we were going out the door, I remembered the substance, and I wondered if perhaps it might have some sort of an effect on her, if it might have made her sick. So I opted at that moment to take a sample of this gelatinous material to the hospital. Dozens of other Oakville residents also reported sudden mysterious illnesses ranging from nausea and vertigo to severe flu-like symptoms. Unlike the flu, however, in many cases these symptoms lasted up to 3 months. Regular safety precautions did little to stave off infection. Indeed, Officer Lacey and Sonny Barcliff both wore gloves while handling the blobs. Nor were humans the only ones affected. 3 days after the blobs fell, Sonny Barcliff's kitten suddenly died, while Dottie Hearn's 2 dogs came down with severe vomiting and diarrhea, the cause of which was never determined. The numerous barn cats and other animals residing on Dottie Hearn's farm also mysteriously vanished, while frogs, ravens, and other wild animals were found dead near clumps of blobs, green slime dripping from their mouths. Local farmers even reported larger animals like cows and horses falling seriously ill after coming into contact with the substance. And the August the 7th downpour was not an isolated incident. Over the following 3 weeks, the blobs rained down a further 5 times, each fall accompanied by a wave of human and animal illness. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the blobs were gone, dissolved into the soil or evaporated into the air, leaving few clues as to their nature or origin. Thankfully, Sonny Barcliff still had the sample from Dottie Hearn's farm, which she brought to Dr. David Little, her mother's attending physician at McCleary Hospital. While Dr. Little was skeptical that the blobs had caused Dottie Hearn's illness, he nonetheless agreed to send the sample to the lab for analysis. It was here that a lab tech made a surprising discovery. The mysterious blobs contained human white blood cells. Stranger still, all these cells were missing their nuclei, the central organelles that contain a cell's genetic material. Baffled, Barcliff next took the sample to the Washington State Department of Health Laboratories in Seattle, where microbiologist Michael McDowell spread the blobs on a nutrient medium to see if anything would grow. The cell culture eventually yielded colonies of 2 bacteria commonly found in the human gut, Pseudomonas fluorescens and Enterobacter coliaceae. Neither, however, is known to be harmful to humans or can account for the severe symptoms experienced by the residents of Oakville. The next scientist to examine the blobs was Michael Osweiler of the Washington Department of Ecology, who confirmed the McCleary Hospital lab's findings that the substance contained eukaryotic, that is, nucleus-bearing cells. Tim Davis, a microbiologist at the private firm Amtest Laboratories, came to the same conclusion, though he, like Osweiler, was unable to determine the exact species or origin of the cells. And while modern analysis techniques could theoretically shed more light on the mysterious substance, shortly after presenting his report to his supervisor, Michael Osweiler returned to his lab to discover that Sonny Barcliff's precious sample had vanished. According to Osweiler, it is the first and only time in his 30 years with the Department of Ecology that a sample under his care has gone missing. At this point, we could cue the X-Files theme. In the absence of hard evidence, speculation as to the origins of the Oakville blobs has run rampant. One early theory, posited by Michael Osweiler, was that the blobs were concentrated liquid waste dropped from a commercial airliner. However, the Federal Aviation Authority quickly quashed this theory, pointing out that airplane toilet waste is dyed deep blue to allow leaks to be easily spotted. The next popular theory was far more outlandish, attributing the blob's appearance to U.S. Air Force bombing practice conducted over the Pacific Ocean. According to this theory, these bombing runs obliterated large schools of jellyfish and blasted their pulverized remains into the upper atmosphere, from where they rained down onto the Oakville area. And for more on another Pacific Northwest town where it rained chunks of considerably larger animal, please check out our video, The Curious Case of Exploding Whales. While Master Sergeant Thaddeus Hosley, spokesman at McCord Air Force Base, later confirmed that the 354th Fighter Squadron was indeed conducting live bombing practice 12 kilometers off the coast around the time of the incident, this theory fails to explain why the blobs only fell over the Oakville area. Also, why all the blobs were of uniform size, or why pieces of other marine creatures were also not found on the ground. Nor does it explain the mysterious symptoms experienced by those who came into contact with the blobs, the effects of jellyfish stings being considerably different. Despite this, the jellyfish theory proved so popular that the residents of Oakville discussed holding an annual jellyfish festival to commemorate the events of August 1994. One local bar even invented a jellyfish cocktail composed of vodka, fruit juice, and jello. But while jellyfish were almost certainly not responsible for the Oakville blobs, it is still possible that the US Air Force was, and this brings us to by far the darkest theory regarding the incident. In his report to the Washington Department of Ecology, Michael Osweiler stated that under the microscope, the Oakville blobs appeared to be man-made, with tiny cavities seemingly designed to hold and disperse bacteria. At the same time, Oakville residents reported a noticeable increase in Air Force activity over their town in the days leading up to the incident, with Dottie Hearn recalling, "We had a significant amount of military aircraft flying over the home prior to this happening. Every day almost. We had slow-flying bombers, helicopters, all black in color, and we kind of thought maybe it might have come from them." These reports suggest that the Oakville incident might not have been an accident, and that the town had in fact been the target of US Air Force experiments on biological warfare. This is not as outlandish as it may sound. Between 1949 and 1969, the US military sprayed various American cities, including San Francisco, Minneapolis, St. Louis, and New York, with simulated biowarfare agents to determine how vulnerable they were to biological attack. These simulated biological agents included chemicals such as zinc cadmium sulfide and bacteria such as Bacillus globigii, then thought to be harmless to humans. As you might have guessed, these substances turned out to be rather more dangerous than initially believed, and are believed to have caused hundreds of severe illnesses and deaths, but well, that's a topic for another video. However, without confirmation from the US government, this explanation for the Oakville incident remains little more than a tantalizing conspiracy theory. A less exciting, though far more likely theory holds that the blobs were, in fact, grains of chemical sodium polyacrylate, a gelatinous polymer capable of absorbing 800 times its weight in water. Sodium polyacrylate is used in a variety of products, including disposable diapers, menstrual pads, bandages, and cold packs, and as a thickener in food, drilling fluid, and industrial coatings. It's also used in agriculture to help retain moisture in the soil. According to this theory, polyacrylate particles from a nearby farmer's field were swept up by the wind and carried into the upper atmosphere, where they absorbed water, swelled into gelatinous pellets, and rained back to the ground. A similar incident occurred in 2012 near Bournemouth in England, lending further credence to this theory, though in the latter case the polyacrylate particles were already in the soil and swelled during a rainstorm, giving the impression that they had fallen from the sky overnight. Yet another theory posits that the blobs were a form of star jelly, a mysterious gelatinous substance that suddenly appears on the ground overnight and which has appeared in scientific reports and poetry since at least the 17th century. Once believed to have been deposited by passing comets and shooting stars, star jelly is now thought to be, among other things, the remains of amphibian reproductive organs and spawn vomited up by birds and other predators, blobs of blue-green algae known as nostoc, or colonies of gelatinous single-celled organisms called slime molds. Once again, however, these theories fail to account for the strange symptoms experienced by those who came into contact with the Oakville blobs. Here, the most likely explanation might be the most disappointing, namely that the two phenomena, in fact, have nothing to do with each other. For despite the endless analysis and speculation surrounding the Oakville blobs, no rigorous epidemiological study of the incident has ever been conducted. Supposed human victims of the blobs were never systematically interviewed or examined, dead animals were never collected or necropsied, and aside from the preliminary examinations of Sonny Barcliffe's sample conducted by the McCleary Hospital, Department of Health, and Department of Ecology, no further analysis of the blobs has been performed. Thus, the evidence linking the Oakville blobs to the outbreak of severe vertigo and flu-like symptoms is largely circumstantial, based on anecdote and hearsay. Furthermore, through countless retellings for news outlets and television programs like Unsolved Mysteries, key details have been ignored or altered in the interests of telling a good story. For instance, Sonny Barcliffe's kitten was already suffering from severe digestive issues at the time the blobs fell, and its death, and that of all the animals in the area, may have thus been a complete coincidence. We humans are born pattern seekers, and the close proximity between the blobs falling and the outbreak of strange illnesses may very well have led Oakville residents to link together two completely unrelated incidents. But with 30 years having passed since the incidents, its supposed victims have long since recovered, and the only known sample of the blobs mysteriously disappeared, so we may never know for sure. All we can do is keep watching the skies, because the truth is out there.
In the 1888 Rudyard Kipling short story, The Man Who Would Be King, two British soldiers serving in India, Daniel Dravers and Tolliver Preachy Carnahan, decide to desert the army and set themselves up as the kings of Kafiristan, a remote region in the mountains of Afghanistan. But while Dravers and Carnahan's plan ultimately goes horribly awry, the fantasy of ruling over one's own foreign kingdom resonated with imperialist British attitudes of the day, making Kipling's tale extremely popular and inspiring countless similar works of fiction. But while on its face outlandish, the story of The Man Who Would Be King has actually taken place in real life. For example, Frederick Wilson, a British adventurer known as the Raja of Harsil, ruled a region of the Himalayas from 1859 until his death in 1880, even minting his own coinage. In 1841, another adventurer, Sir James Brooke, founded a dynasty of white Rajas which ruled over the Raj of Sarawak on the island of Borneo until 1946. And in 1904, a shipwrecked Swedish sailor unexpectedly found himself the unlikely ruler of a South Pacific island inhabited by cannibals. This is the extraordinary story of Carl Pettersson, the real man who would be king. Carl Emil Pettersson was born in the village of Sollentuna, Sweden, on October 23rd, 1875, one of 6 children born to Carl Wilhelm and Johanna Pettersson. Little is known about Pettersson's early life, but Carl Wilhelm left the family when Carl Emil was still young, forcing his mother to raise him and his siblings on her own. In 1882, at the age of 17, Pettersson left home to make his living at sea. Over the next 6 years, he sailed around the world, surviving several shipwrecks and earning a reputation as a skilled and extremely strong sailor, traits that, as we shall see, would eventually prove very useful. In 1888, he began working for the New Guinea Compagnie, a German trading establishment headquarters at Kokopo in northeastern Papua New Guinea. The job involved making long voyages between Europe and the South Pacific, but Pettersson relished the work, and for the next 6 years he enjoyed a productive life at sea. However, Pettersson's charmed existence came to an abrupt end when, on Christmas Day 1904, his ship, the Zog Johan Albrecht, sank in a storm off Tabar Island, part of the Bismarck archipelago of northeast Papua New Guinea. Pettersson survived the sinking and washed ashore in a hibiscus hedge, where he soon found himself surrounded by curious islanders. Pettersson had every reason to be frightened. At the time, many Papuan tribes were known to practice cannibalism both for survival and ritualistic purposes. Indeed, it is still practiced in many parts of Papua New Guinea today, though to a far lesser extent due to government prohibitions and the potentially horrific health effects. And for more on this, please do check out our previous video, The Gruesome Tale of the Laughing Death Epidemic. But then Pettersson did something that likely saved his life. He opened his eyes, which were bright blue. The islanders surrounding him were stunned, having never seen someone with blue eyes before. They lowered their weapons, and they carried Pettersson to a nearby village to meet their leader, King Lamry. Lamry was immediately impressed by the shipwrecked Swede, who, beside looking nothing like the islanders had ever seen, was also charming, and to their eyes, superhumanly strong, earning him the nickname Strong Charlie. The islanders gave Pettersson food, water, and shelter, and allowed him to regain his strength, and then let him wander freely around the island. From his work with the New Guinea Compagnie, Pettersson quickly realized that the island's soil was fertile and well drained, making it perfect for growing coconuts. He thus approached King Lamry and made him an offer that he couldn't refuse, promising to make him and his people rich by turning Tabar into a massive coconut plantation. Lamry agreed, and Pedersen soon delivered on his promise. His plantation, named Terapax, or Peaceful Land, quickly became a giant in the local copra, or coconut flesh trade, and the once impoverished island of Tabor flourished. Over the next 3 years, Pedersen made several trips back to Sweden, but ultimately came to see Tabor as his home. During this time, he fell in love with King Lamry's daughter, Princess Singdo Misa, and in 1907 they were married. The couple would go on to have 9 children together, though one would tragically die shortly after birth. That same year, however, King Lamry died of old age, making Pedersen the rightful heir to the throne. Pedersen took his role as king seriously, promising to bring his people even greater prosperity. Once again, he delivered, expanding his coconut empire by establishing 2 new plantations, Maragon on Simberi Island and Londalovit on the Lihir Islands. King Carl I, as he was known, proved extremely popular with the people of Tabar, respecting local customs and treating the workers on his plantations with compassion. News of the Swedish King of Tabar first came to the world's attention in 1903 when Swedish diplomat and travel writer Birger Morner visited the islands and took pictures of Pedersen and his family. When Morner's photos and travelogue of his journey as far as Tropitska A were published in Sweden the following year, the story of Carl Pedersen was picked up and published in the daily newspaper Dagens Nyheter under the headline "A Stockholm Boy on the South Sea Islands." The feature caused a sensation, turning Pedersen into a minor celebrity and folk hero, and prompting many other newspapers and magazines, including Harsmodern and Verco Journalen, to run articles about his kingdom over the following 2 decades. Many of these articles, however, were full of tall tales about Strong Charlie and his supposed swashbuckling exploits, many of which came straight from Pedersen himself. But the good times did not last, and in 1921, Queen Singdo tragically died of puerperal or childbed fever, a streptococcus infection that commonly struck women shortly after childbirth because the past was the worst. The following year, Pedersen returned to Sweden, hoping to find a new wife to take care of his children. He eventually met and married Jessie Louisa Simpson, with whom he returned to Bar in 1923. However, in Pedersen's absence, the plantations had been mismanaged and his kingdom was close to bankruptcy. He and his wife were also struck down with frequent bouts of malaria. Undeterred, Pedersen doggedly attempted to rebuild his empire, but the global fallout of the Great Depression largely foiled his efforts. However, in a much-needed stroke of luck, he discovered a large gold deposit on Simberi Island, once bringing prosperity to his kingdom. Yet despite these riches, King Carl and Queen Jessie could not access adequate medical care for their failing health on Tabor, and they eventually made the difficult decision to leave. Jessie travelled first to Australia to be treated for malaria before returning to Sweden, only to succumb to complications of the disease and cancer on May 17, 1935. That same year, Carl Pedersen also left Tabor for Australia, but he never returned to Sweden, dying of a heart attack in Sydney on May 12, 1937 at the age of 61. Prior to his death, King Carl I named his eldest son Frederick as his successor. Frederick, who at the time was studying medicine in New Zealand, briefly returned to Duel, but soon decided the life of being a king was not for him. Frederick attempted to sell, then gift his kingdom to Sweden, but both times the government declined. In the end, Bar came under the administration of Australia, along with the rest of Papua New Guinea. While nearly forgotten today, the remarkable tale of Carl Emil Pedersen, the Swedish king of Tabor Island, lives on in one of the 20th century's most beloved works of literature. In 1944, Swedish author Astrid Lindgren published Pippi Longstocking, the first in a long-running series of children's books featuring the titular free-spirited and superhumanly strong red-headed 9-year-old. The book, originally created by Lindgren as a get-well story for her daughter, Corinne, when she was sick with pneumonia, has been translated into 76 languages, sold over 150 million copies worldwide, and been named one of the 100 most influential literary works of the 20th century. In the stories, Pippa's father, Ephraim, is a sailor who disappears at sea, only to turn up as the king of a South Seas island, a concept lifted directly from the incredible real-life story of Carl Pedersen.
Lasting from 1945 to 1991, the Cold War was one of the most dangerous periods in human history. For nearly 5 decades, East and West stood locked in an ever-escalating nuclear arms race, fingers poised on the buttons that would unleash global Armageddon. In such a tense atmosphere, even minor errors could prove disastrous, and on numerous occasions, humanity came dangerously close to wiping itself out. From alert systems mistaking clouds or the moon for incoming missiles, to a training tape being accidentally inserted into a defense computer, the causes of these near misses are as terrifying as they are absurd, underscoring how truly lucky we are to have survived the 20th century without a global nuclear conflict. One of the closest calls humanity has ever faced took place a full 4 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, revealing that while the Cold War may be over, the threat of nuclear annihilation is still very much with us. This is the story of the 1995 Norwegian rocket incident. In the early morning hours of January the 25th, 1995, operators of the Missile Alert Warning System, or MAWS radar station in Olenogorsk, Russia, detected a small, fast-moving object rising from the northern coast of Norway. As the operators watched, the object sailed in a high arc over the Barents Sea. The size and trajectory of the object matched that of an American Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missile, and it was headed straight for Moscow. While the launch of a single missile was unusual, after all, a preemptive strike should have involved dozens of missiles, there was a possible explanation. The missile was set to detonate in the upper atmosphere, generating an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, that would blind Russian defenses to the coming all-out attack. Alternatively, it could have been aimed at the Russian nuclear submarine base at Murmansk on the Kola Peninsula. With less than 10 minutes left until the missile reached Moscow, the operators at Olenogorsk sounded the alert. Using a special terminal codenamed Crocus, the duty general entered the data from the radar into Kavkaz, the complex network of cables, radio relays, and satellites at the heart of Russia's nuclear command and control network. In Moscow, Russian President Boris Yeltsin, Defense Minister Pavel Grachev, and Chief of the General Staff Mikhail Kolesniko were pulled aside and handed the Cheget, the briefcase-sized transmitter that controls Russia's nuclear arsenal. Following a well-rehearsed procedure, the three men opened and activated their briefcases and prepared to launch a retaliatory strike. Though Yeltsin nominally had sole legal authority to authorize a launch, the other two, as well as the Army General Staff, could assume this responsibility if he became incapacitated. Meanwhile, the missile had broken up into 4 sections, the telltale signature of multiple independent re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs. Unlike the United States, Russia follows a launch-on-warning doctrine, meaning a retaliatory strike can be launched as soon as enemy missiles are detected. This prevents a preemptive strike from destroying Russia's ability to launch a counterstrike, preserving the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Yet Yeltsin hesitated. For 4 long minutes, he kept his military commanders in agonizing suspense, waiting to see how the situation unfolded. This would prove a wise decision, for 8 minutes after the alert was sounded, the object veered from its Moscow-bound trajectory and crashed into the Arctic Ocean. The alert was called off, and the strategic nuclear forces stood down. Hours later, the Russians learned what the mysterious object was. It was a Black Brant 12 rocket launched by Norwegian and American scientists from the Andoya rocket range in northeast Norway. Developed by Bristol Aerospace in Winnipeg, Canada, the Black Brant is one of the world's most successful sounding rockets, a type of small research vehicle used for studying the upper atmosphere and outer space. Since 1959, over 1,000 Black Brants have been launched by Canada, the United States, Norway, and other countries, and have contributed to dozens of scientific breakthroughs, such as determining the cause of the Aurora Borealis or the Northern Lights. The latest iteration of the system, the Black Brant 12, can reach altitudes of over 1,500 kilometers, higher than the orbit of the International Space Station. Unfortunately for Russia and the rest of the world, the separation of the rocket's 4 stages appears on radar very much like a missile releasing multiple warheads. Even worse, the Norwegian rocket's trajectory happened to coincide with an air and space corridor used by American Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles en route from their silos in the American Midwest to Russia. So, what went wrong? Why did Norway not warn Russia of the Black Brant launch? Well, actually, they did. 1 month earlier, on December the 21st, 1994, the Norwegian Foreign Ministry sent a routine message to neighboring countries, including Russia, announcing an impending launch between January 15th and February 10th, depending on weather conditions. Somehow, however, the message got lost in Russian bureaucracy and never made it to the MAWS radar operators. This simple oversight was all it took to bring the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Or was it? Though the Norwegian rocket incident is widely cited as one of the closest calls in the history of nuclear weapons, some deny that the world was ever really in any real danger. According to Vladimir Dvorkin, director of Russia's 4th Central Research Institute, President Yeltsin was fully aware that the rogue radar contact was not a threat. For in addition to ground-based radars, Russia maintains a fleet of early warning satellites codenamed Okko, which would have indicated that the Norwegian rocket was not a nuclear missile. Yeltsin would thus have never authorized a full-scale retaliatory attack. Quote, "It's very difficult to make a decision, maybe even impossible for civilized leaders. Even when a warning system gives you a signal about a massive attack, no one is ever going to make a decision. Even an irrational leader alarms that one missile has been fired. I think this is an empty alarm." End quote. Indeed, when Yeltsin appeared before the media the day after the incident and announced he had activated the Cheget, many dismissed the claim as a show of bravado meant to distract the Russian people from the ever-worsening war in Chechnya. But others, like MAWS expert Nikolai Devyanin, disagree, arguing that multiple factors led the radar operators and Russian government to treat the Norwegian rocket as a very real threat.
Less than a decade before, in 1987, Russia's confidence in its own defenses was severely shaken when Matthias Rust, a German teenager, flew a light aircraft over the border and landed in the middle of Red Square. Wishing to avoid a repeat of this humiliation, the Soviet and later Russian military leadership placed Moors and other defense system technicians on perpetual high alert. This led to a toxic environment of overwork, as Russian journalist Oleg Falachev explained, quoting him, "At times, the officers who perform alert duty are so exhausted at the end of a shift that they don't feel either their hands or their feet." According to Devinin, this high-stress environment, coupled with internal politics, made the outcome all but inevitable. Quoting again, "There was not time to ask their superiors for advice, but they did not want to become scapegoats for another Matthias Rust." In this situation, the duty officers made the sole possible decision to work according to plan as prescribed by instructions and as has been practiced dozens of times in drill sessions. And even if Vladimir Dvorkin is correct, and Yeltsin did not actually take the alert seriously, the Norwegian rocket incident nonetheless exposed serious flaws in Russia's nuclear command and control system, which, if left unaddressed, could lead to further, potentially more serious incidents. For instance, the launch on alert doctrine, while ideally suited to the Cold War regime of mutually assured destruction, significantly increases the risks of false alarms escalating out of control. In addition, Russia's missile alert radar system is dangerously fragmented and dilapidated. During the Soviet period, most of Russia's missile warning radars were located in its satellite states such as Ukraine, Latvia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many of these radars suddenly fell out of Moscow's control. While Russia managed to broker agreements with several newly independent nations to continue operating their radars, other sites were demolished by their new owners, leaving large gaps in Russia's defensive network. For instance, Russia is almost entirely blind to missile attacks launched from Asia and the Pacific. Worse still, what does remain of the system is old, poorly maintained, and prone to malfunctioning. As retired Soviet Colonel Robert Bykov revealed, "Even in my period of service, the equipment ceased functioning properly on more than one occasion, or certain parts of it spontaneously went into combat mode. You can imagine what is happening now." So, although the notification protocols for peaceful rocket launches have since been updated, so long as the flaws in the Russian nuclear command and control system remain uncorrected, another Norwegian rocket incident is entirely possible. With the fate of the world then in the hands of the leaders in charge in Russia and how they decide to react to it.
And now how about a bonus fact? Speaking of the men in charge and how they react to a tense situation, perhaps ruling the fate of the world, this all brings us to that time one man, Vasily Arkhipov, quite literally saved the world, only to see his superiors more or less tell him they wished he died rather than do what he did to save the world from nuclear annihilation. In May of 1962, Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev and Cuban President Fidel Castro reached a secret agreement that allowed the Soviets to start building missile sites in Cuba, including stocking them with nuclear missiles, 42 of them in fact. It should be noted here that the US at this time had nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy that could hit Moscow within 16 minutes of being launched. On the flip side, the Soviets had plenty of nukes pointed at and perfectly capable of destroying the US's allies throughout Europe. However, the Soviets did not have nearly the capability to destroy targets in the United States itself. Certainly, they had enough nukes to destroy all the major cities in the US and more, but they were lacking in reliable intercontinental ballistic missiles to adequately function as a mutual destruction deterrent. Indeed, there were some among the US brass that felt the loss of allies throughout Europe and the lesser direct casualties from long-range nukes that managed to hit their targets in the United States were acceptable losses, given the payoff would be the annihilation of the Soviet Union and the end of the threat to the United States. So if the Soviet Union had nukes in Cuba, that tipped the balance in the Cold War back to near even, rather than in the United States' favor as before. In the fall of 1962, the United States sent a US U-2 aircraft to fly over Cuba in an attempt to confirm the rumors that they had heard about the Soviet missile sites in Cuba. On October the 14th, 1962, the U-2 arrived back with pictures of these missile sites. A day later, the pictures were presented to President Kennedy. Tensions rose and alarms were sounded.
We now know that the Soviet Union, not content with Dr. Castro's oath of fealty, not content with the destruction of Cuban independence, not content with the extension of Soviet power into the Western Hemisphere, not content with a challenge to the inter-American system and to the United Nations Charter, has decided to transform Cuba into a base for communist aggression, into a base for putting all of the Americas under the nuclear gun.
The United States' answer to what Adlai Stevenson termed Soviet blackmail in Cuba was a quarantine of all offensive weapons being shipped from Russia to that island fortress. The U.S. threw up a steel fence, prepared to stop any vessel carrying materials of war.
And thus, on October the 15th, 1962, the 13-day ordeal that became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis began. This brings us to the man of the hour, Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov was born on January the 30th, 1926 to a poor peasant family near Moscow. At the age of 16, he began his education at the Pacific Higher Naval School. Vasily saw his first military action as a minesweeper in the Pacific Theater at the tail end of World War II. In 1947, he graduated from the Caspian Higher Naval School and served on submarines in the Soviet Black Sea, Northern, and Baltic fleets. In 1961, Vasily got his first taste of crisis management in an incident that, while extremely momentous, wasn't even close to what he'd help with later. This first incident happened when Vasily was appointed deputy commander of the new K-19 sub, known today as the Widowmaker, thanks to the 2002 movie K-19, The Widowmaker, but in its day nicknamed by the Russians Hiroshima. This sub was one of the first Soviet nuclear submarines, which was also equipped with a nuclear ballistic missile. On July the 4th, 1961, as the sub was conducting exercises near Greenland, a major leak was discovered in the radiant cooling system. Since no backup cooling system was installed pre-sale, the reactor on the sub was in real danger of a nuclear meltdown. In order to prevent a nuclear accident unlike any the world had ever seen before, the captain of the sub sent workers into high radiation areas to build a cooling system on the spot. Every single member of the sub did what they could to prevent disaster, including Vasily lending his engineering expertise to help contain the overheating reactor. The crew succeeded, but not before these workers and many on the crew developed radiation sickness. Every worker that was sent as first responders into the high radiation areas died within days. Due to this, a mutiny nearly erupted on board the K-19 sub. In this case, Vasily backed his captain in continuing the work and was eventually awarded the Medal for Bravery in time of crisis and loyalty to the Soviet Union. All of this was a precursor to the day Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. After his time on the K-19 sub, Vasily was made second command on the B-59, one of 4 attack submarines that was ordered to travel to Cuba on October the 1st, 1962. The sub contained 22 torpedoes, one of which was nuclear, holding approximately the same yield as a bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. The captains of each of the 4 subs were given permission to fire their nuclear torpedoes at their own discretion, so long as they had the backing of the political officer on board. Unknown to the crew of the B-59, the United States began their naval blockade of Cuba on October the 24th and informed the Soviets that they would be dropping practice depth charge, think warning shots, to force subs to surface and be identified. Moscow could not communicate this information to the B-59 due to it being too deep underwater to receive radio transmissions. And so it was that on October the 27th, 1962, U.S. destroyers and the aircraft carrier USS Randolph located the sub, trapped it, and began dropping depth charges to force it to surface. The sub's crew, which had been traveling for nearly 4 weeks with very little communication with Moscow, was very tired and not aware of the circumstances. The sub's captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed that nuclear war had already broken out between the Soviet Union and the US and wanted to fire the nuclear torpedo. The political officer concurred, all that was normally needed to launch. Fortunately, particularly given the heightened tensions at the time, in this case, one other person had veto power over firing besides the captain and the political officer, the second in command, Vasily Arkhipov. You see, Vasily, despite being second in command on the B-59, was the leader of the fleet of the 4 Soviet subs sent. Had Vasily not been present, nuclear war would have likely happened, as both the captain and the political officer wanted to launch the nuclear torpedo and would otherwise have been able to. However, Vasily vehemently disagreed, arguing that since no orders had come from Moscow for many days, such a drastic action was ill-advised and the sub should surface to contact Moscow to assess the situation. A heated argument broke out. Legend, probably false, says punches were thrown. Eventually, though, Vasily won the day. His reputation as a hero in the K-19 mutiny reportedly helped in the debate, and the sub finally surfaced. Upon surfacing, they were met by their American enemies and instructed to head back to Russia. They obliged, Nuclear war was averted. Vasily Arkhipov was a hero once again. When the sub arrived back in Russia, however, the crew of the B-59 were met with trepidation. After all, they had pretty much surrendered to the Americans. Said one Russian admiral to Vasily, "It would have been better if you'd gone down with your ship." Despite the not-so-hero's welcome he originally received from the Soviets upon his return, Vasily continued serving in the Soviet Navy and ultimately, in 1975, was promoted to Rear Admiral. Later, he would become the head of the Kirov Naval Academy. He retired in the mid-1980s and passed away in 1999 at the age of 73 as a result of complications due to radiation poisoning from back aboard the K-19. Despite few in the wider world having ever heard of him or ever giving him any credit at all, at least one person recognized the significance of what Vasily had done on the 27th of October 1962, his wife, Olga Vasily, who always recognized him as the man who saved the world, stating, "The man who prevented a nuclear war was a Russian submariner. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. I was proud, and I am proud of my husband always." On July the 6th, 2022, around 4 a.m., a loud explosion rocked a remote corner of Elbert County, Georgia. Later that morning, the sun rose to reveal the shattered remains of America's most mysterious and controversial public monument, the Georgia Guidestones. From the moment they were unveiled in 1980, these 6 massive granite slabs covered in inscriptions became a magnet for criticism and conspiracy theories, with many detractors accusing the monument of promoting Satanism. As a result, the Georgia Guidestones became a target for numerous vandals, culminating in its bombing and demolition 42 years later. But what were the Georgia Guidestones really? Who designed them? What was their purpose? And why did they attract so much fear and hate? Let's find out as we dive into the fascinating and controversial history of America's Stonehenge. Our story begins one Friday afternoon in June of 1979 when a mysterious man using the pseudonym Robert C. Christian contacted Joe Fenley, president of the Elberton Granite Finishing Company in Elberton, Georgia, to commission an ambitious monument. Christian claimed to represent a, to quote, small group of loyal Americans who had been planning this project for over 20 years. Inspired by the legendary Neolithic monument Stonehenge in England, Christian and his colleagues wished to erect an American counterpart which would serve as a guide to rebuilding civilization following an apocalyptic event. Designed to survive earthquakes, nuclear attack, financial collapse, and other calamities, the monument would display instructions in multiple languages and incorporate several useful functions, including a compass, a sundial, and a calendar. To host the monument, Christian had purchased a 5-acre plot of cattle grazing pasture from farmer Wayne Mullenix for $5,000, allowing Mullenix to retain grazing rights on the plot. Located off Georgia State Route 77, 11 kilometers or 7 miles north of Elberton, Christian selected the site due to its rural location, mild climate, his ancestral ties to the area, and the region's abundant supply of granite. Indeed, Elbert County is known as the granite capital of Georgia, with the local quarrying industry employing more than 2,000 people. Furthermore, the chosen site also stood close to an area the local Cherokee Indians called Alyali Alohi, the center of the world. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Fenley was initially skeptical of Christian's proposal, later recalling that, "I was thinking, I got a nut in here now, how am I going to get him out?" Fenley even tried to dissuade Christian by providing a manufacturing quote many times higher than anything the company had previously attempted, but to his shock, Christian readily accepted the inflated quote. At this point, Fenley recalled, "I perked up my ear and started making notes because I realized this stranger was much smarter than I first thought and seemed very sincere about the project." Soon after, the mysterious visitor provided Fenley with a scale model of the monument and 10 pages of detailed instructions. A half hour later, Mr. Christian showed up at the office of Wyatt C. Martin, president of the Granite City Bank. As Martin later recalled, "Fenley called me and said, 'A kook over here wants some kind of crazy monument.' But when this fella showed up, he was wearing a very nice, expensive suit, which made me take him a little more seriously, and he was well-spoken, obviously an educated person, and when he told me what it was he and his group wanted to do, I just about fell over. I told him, I believe you'd be just as well off to take the money and throw it out in the street into the gutters. He just sort of looked at me and shook his head like he felt kind of sorry for me and said, 'You don't understand.'" When Christian returned the following Monday to finalize the deal, Martin refused unless the mystery man could confirm his identity and his source of funding. Eventually, the two struck an unusual deal. Christian agreed to reveal his true identity on the condition that Martin never reveal it to anyone else, act as his sole intermediary throughout the project, and destroy all correspondence and other documents once the work was complete. As Martin later recalled, Christian went to great lengths to ensure that neither he nor his colleague could ever be identified. He said he was going to send the money from different banks across the country because he wanted to make sure it couldn't be traced. All of Mr. Christian's correspondence came from different cities around the country. He never sent anything from the same place twice. He made it clear that he was very serious about secrecy. While the total price tag for the Georgia Guidestones has never been officially revealed, it is estimated to be in excess of $100,000, more than $400,000 in today's money. With the deal finalized, Robert Christian told Joe Fenley, "You'll never see me again," walked right out of his office and disappeared. Thereafter, all correspondence regarding the Guidestones project was conducted through Wyatt Martin. Construction on the Georgia Guidestones began soon after, with the quarrying and finishing being performed by Alberton Granite Finish Company under project superintendent Joe Davis, while sandblasting the inscriptions was handled by Mark Clamp of Clamp Sandblasting. Meanwhile, installation of the foundation stones was handled by landowner Wayne Mullenix Construction Company. And so it was that after 9 months of work, the Georgia Guidestones were finally unveiled on March the 22nd, 1980, by Democratic Congressman Doug Barnard in front of a crowd of 400 people. But Robert C. Christian was not among them. As he and his group later wrote, "The group feels by having our identity remain secret, it will not distract from the monument and its meaning. The message to be inscribed on the stones is to all mankind and is non-sectarian, nor nationalistic, nor in any sense political. The stones must speak for themselves and should appeal to believers and non-believers wherever and at all times." The finished monument comprised of 11 massive rough-hewn granite slabs quarried from the pyramid quarries in Alberton. The dimensions on all of them would be rather meaningless and get messy to read out loud, but are up on the screen now. What's far more interesting than the dimensions is that each of the faces of the 4 outer upright slabs were inscribed with the following message to humanity, written in 8 different languages: Arabic, Chinese, English, Hebrew, Hindi, Russian, Spanish, and Swahili. Maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. Guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity. Unite humanity with a living new language. Rule passion, faith, tradition, and all things with tempered reason. Protect people and nations with fair laws and just courts. Let all nations rule internally, resolving external disputes in a world court. Avoid petty laws and useless officials. Balance personal rights with social duties. Prize truth, beauty, love, seeking harmony with the infinite. Be not a cancer on the earth. Leave room for nature. Leave room for nature. In addition, the following message was written on the vertical edge of the capstone in 4 ancient languages: Babylonian, cuneiform, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, Sanskrit, and classical Greek. Let these be guidestones to an age of reason. As it was unknown when guidestones might ultimately be needed, it was hoped that knowledge of at least one of these languages would survive far into the future. The central slab bore no written message, but instead incorporated a number of astronomical features. For example, a hole drilled through the slab allowing the North Star Polaris to be seen, providing a compass bearing. A separate slot cut in the column also aligned with the solar solstice and equinoxes. Every day at local noon, a third aperture in the capstone projected a beam of light into the central slab, whose angle indicated the day of the year and served as a crude calendar. Finally, the 4 outer slabs were aligned with the limits of the lunar declination cycle, the elliptical path the moon makes across the sky every 18.6 years. And to learn more on how humans have traditionally navigated and told time using the heavens, why not check out Our Own Devices, the personal channel of this video's author, Gilles Messier, which features dozens of videos on sextants, sundials, and other fascinating celestial instruments. Gilles is the best, and his channel is criminally undersubscribed for its quality and fascinating information. In any event, in addition to the main cluster, the Georgia Guidestones also included a separate explanatory tablet set flush with the ground a few feet west. This included a variety of useful information, including the names of the languages inscribed on the upright slabs, the astronomical features integrated into the monument, as well as the following credits. The Georgia Guidestone Center Cluster erected March 22, 1980. Let these be guidestones to an age of reason. Author R.C. Christian, a pseudonym. Sponsors, a small group of Americans who seek the age of reason. Additional information available at Alberton Granite Museum and Exhibit College Avenue, Alberton, Georgia. Finally, the tablet indicated that a time capsule had been buried 1.83 meters or 6 feet beneath it. However, at the time of the monument's unveiling, the year said capsule was meant to be opened had not yet been engraved, making it unclear whether it had even been buried at all. It now appears that it was not, for when the monument was demolished following the July 2022 bombing, officials dug 6 feet below the explanatory tablet and found nothing. Noteworthy, the original plan called for an additional circle of stones to be constructed around the central cluster to make the monument even more like the original Stonehenge, but nothing ever came of this. But going back to the early days of the monument, though every effort was made to emphasize the benign and universal message of the guidestones, Christian and his colleagues nonetheless anticipated that this message might be misinterpreted. They thus prepared a statement to be read aloud during the monument's unveiling. In order to avoid debate, we, the sponsors of the Georgia Guidestones, have a simple message for human beings, now and for the future. We believe our precepts are sound and they must stand on their own merits. 6 years later, Christian also published a book titled Common Sense Renewed, in which he wrote, "I am the originator of the Georgia Guidestones and the sole author of its inscriptions. I have had the assistance of a number of other American citizens in bringing the monument into being. We have no mysterious purposes or ulterior motives. We seek common sense pathways to a peaceful world without bias for particular creeds or philosophies." Later publications further expanded upon the group's philosophy and intentions, with one companion booklet explaining that Stonehenge and other vestige of human thought arouse our curiosity but carry no message for our guidance. To convey our ideas across time to other human beings, we want to erect a monument, a cluster of graven stones which will silently display our ideas when we have gone. We hope they will merit increasing acceptance and that through their silent persistence, they will hasten in a small degree the coming of Age of Reason. It is very probable that humanity now possesses the knowledge needed to establish an effective world government. In some way, that knowledge must be widely seeded in the consciousness of mankind. Very soon, the hearts of our human family must be touched and warmed so we will welcome a global rule of reason. The group consciousness of our race is blind, perverse, and easily distracted by trivia when it should be focused on fundamentals. We are entering a critical era. Population pressures will soon create political and economic crisis throughout the world. These will make more difficult and at the same time more needed the building of rational world society. We are like a fleet of overcrowded lifeboats confronted with an approaching tempest. There are alternatives to Armageddon. They are attainable. The first step will be to convince a doubting world that such a society is now possible. Let us keep in view enduring appeals to the collective reason of humanity. Let us draw attention to the basic problems. Let us establish proper priorities. We must order our home here on Earth before we reach for the stars. Human reason is now awakening to its strengths. It is the most powerful agency yet released in the unfolding life on our planet. We must make humanity aware that acceptance of compassionate, enlightened reason will let us control our destiny within the limits inherent in our nature. It is difficult to seed wisdom in closed human minds. Cultural inertias are not easily overcome. Unfolding world events and the sad record of our race dramatize the shortcomings of traditional agencies in governing human affairs. The approaching crisis may make humankind willing to accept a system of world law which will stress the responsibility of individual nations in regulating internal affairs, and which will assist then in the peaceful management of international frictions. With such a system, we could eliminate war. We could provide every person an opportunity to seek a life of purpose and fulfillment. As you might imagine, despite the intentions, the Georgia Guidestones immediately sparked fierce backlash, especially from conservative Christians. Many interpreted the monument as a cult or even satanic, with some referring to the 10 guidelines inscribed on the slabs as the 10 Commandments of the Antichrist. Conservative YouTuber, political commentator, and conspiracy theorist Mark Dice declared that Robert Christian and his colleagues were a Luciferian secret society, and that the elite are planning to develop successful life extension technology in the next few decades that will nearly stop the aging process, and they fear that with the current population of Earth so high, the masses will be using resources that the elite want for themselves. The Guidestones are the New World Order's 10 Commandments. They're also a way for the elite to get a laugh at the expense of the uniformed masses, as their agenda stands clear as day and the zombies don't even notice it. The Guidestones should be smashed into a million pieces, and then the rubble should be used for a construction project. While Arkansas's conspiracy theorist Van Smith wrote that the purpose of the monument's 10 edicts is to establish the groundwork for a totalitarian global government. The proportions of the stones predict the exact height in feet of Dubai's Burj Khalifa, now the world's tallest building. Both the Guidestones and the Burj allude to the Tower of Babel. Also be aware that there's supposed to be a time capsule buried a few feet west of the monument. According to the story, the capsule is only to be opened when signs are made obvious by the monument of an impending global cataclysm, and the North Star sighting hole is probably the feature that was intended for detecting the feared cataclysmic event. If the story I was told was true, the hole is similar to a device created by the Hopi to detect a similar calamity. And while these interpretations are, to put it as gently as possible, rather out there, Robert Christian and his group, whoever they are, didn't do themselves many favors. For while in many of their writings they profess to be non-religious, with one companion booklet to the Guidestones stating that we profess no divine inspiration beyond that which can be found in all human minds, our thoughts reflect our analysis of the problems confronting humanity in this dawning of the atomic age. They outline in general terms the basic steps which must be taken to establish for humanity a benevolent and enduring equilibrium in the universe. But in the very next paragraph, they write, "Human beings are special creatures. We are shepherds for all earthly life. In this world, we play a central role in an eternal struggle between good and evil, between the forces which build and those which would destroy. The infinite envelopes all that exists, even struggle, conflict, and change, which may reflect turmoils in the very soul of God." Such apparent contradictions have spurred many to speculate as to the nature of the group responsible for erecting the Guidestones, with some positing that the leader's pseudonym of Robert C. Christian is a reference to the esoteric Rosicrucian order which emerged in Germany in the early 17th century. Indeed, in their first founding document, published in 1614, the order wrote that the word RC should be their seal, mark, and character. Others point to the group's frequent use of the phrase "the Age of Reason" as further proof of their identity, this being the title of the famous 1794 deist treatise by American political activist Thomas Paine, who himself was a Rosicrucian. And still others posit that it is no coincidence that the granite used to build the Guidestones came from, wait for it, Pyramid Quarry. Such conspiratorial rhetoric went far beyond the obscure corners of the internet, however, with Republican gubernatorial primary candidate Candace Taylor publicly declaring the Guidestones satanic and pledging to turn the monument to dust if elected. Meanwhile, on the more secular end of the discourse, the Guidestones' instructions to maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature and guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity, have been interpreted as calls for eugenics and genocide because sure, why not? And at the very mildest end of the criticism spectrum, astronomers like Loris Magnani of the University of Georgia questioned the monument's astronomical value, writing that, "I visited in order to see if they could really function as an observatory, which Stonehenge could have. The Guidestones are an abacus compared to Stonehenge's computer. They're very ordinary. You could do the same thing with concrete in your backyard. To see the North Star, which is at a latitude of 34 degrees, you just drill a hole due north at a 34-degree angle. The hardest part is drilling the concrete. As an astronomer, I can tell you there is nothing much there. As to the instructions on the stone, that's a whole other issue." Yet for their first 3 decades of existence, attacks against the monument remained purely rhetorical. Aside from a barbed wire fence to stop cows from scratching themselves on the stones, no security was deemed necessary, and the Guidestones soon became a local tourist attraction, drawing upwards of 20,000 visitors every year. People held weddings and meditation sessions at the monument, while various pagan groups, including Wiccans, Druids, and Native Americans, regularly used the sites for ceremonial events. While most of these visitors were respectful, a few attempted to make off with pieces of the monument and were swiftly arrested. The local community also embraced the unusual landmark, with Elberton Mayor Daniel Graves stating in an interview that, "It's definitely part of our identity, but it's also not something we think about every single day. It's 7 miles outside of the city limits, and you just don't get that way very often. But I said what I usually say, I think they're great. I sure am proud to have them." It was not until 2008 that the monument came under physical attack. That year, and on several occasions thereafter, vandals splattered polyurethane on the stones and spray painted various slogans, including "Death to the New World Order," "Jesus will beat you Satanists," "No one world government," "I banish all darkness," and "I am Isis, goddess of love." Following these incidents, security cameras were installed on the site. Then, in the early morning of July 6, 2022, 42 years after the stones were first erected, an improvised explosive device was detonated next to the monument, destroying the Swahili Hindi language slab and severely damaging the rest of the structure. Some, like gubernatorial candidate Candace Taylor, cheered the news as allegedly God's retribution, tweeting that God is God all by himself. He can do anything he wants to do. That includes striking down satanic guidestones. Until I see a video that shows me anything but what looked like lightning or the hand of God moving on a situation, I am going to believe it was God. If it was vandalism, then there's cameras everywhere. Of course, when the camera footage later emerged showing the bomber driving up to the monument and planting the explosives, Taylor quickly changed her stance, stating, "Those people should be brought to justice. I don't support demolishing the structure outside of our legal system." And despite her vehement anti-guidestone rhetoric about destroying the monument, Taylor denied any involvement with the bombing. Nor did her campaign succeed in swaying Georgia voters, with Taylor receiving a mere 3.4% of the vote in that year's May 24th primary. Many others, however, were dismayed at this wanton act of vandalism, with Elberton Mayor Daniel Graves stating in an interview that our quirky little roadside oddities stopped being our innocent, joyful tourist attraction that highlighted our industry and spoke so well of our community, and turned it into something dark and sinister. And what was dark and sinister was not written on those stones. Those are just goofy ramblings of some crazy person. The dark and sinister thing is when you put actual explosives to a physical object without regard for the safety of those around, without regard for the will of the community. What irritates us is the conspiracy theorists that have pushed this so hard are trying to do it in the name of righteousness. Well, I want to make it categorically clear that in our community, that's not our view of righteousness. Our view of righteousness is not an almighty God that needs zealots to do his dirty work and destruction. All the dynamite in the world cannot change a man's heart. Only logic, reason, compassion, and demonstrated love can do that. Chris Kubas, executive vice president of the Elbert Granite Association, saw the attack as a disturbing demonstration of what can happen when online conspiracy theories and political rhetoric spill over into the real world, explaining that we had a person running for governor in the state of Georgia, Candace Taylor, who said in her top 20 list was to tear down the Georgia Guidestones. So when you have an already charged atmosphere of people tearing down statues, and then you have somebody who's a politician who runs for public office claiming that she's going to tear them down, it sets the mood for the crazies to come out and do their thing. But the damage was already done. Fearing the explosion had destabilized the rest of the structure, later on the day of the bombing, local officials ordered the remaining slabs knocked down with a backhoe for safety reasons. Soon after, the Elbert County Sheriff's Office, together with the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, or GBI, launched an investigation into the bombing. Yet despite footage showing the suspect arriving at and leaving the scene in a silver sedan, all leads quickly dried up and the case remains unsolved to this day. Meanwhile, local politicians and business people debated restoring the monument to its original state, with Chris Kubas stating that the city is probably the one most likely to be interested in having them built back because it is a huge tourist draw for Elberton. It got a lot of tourism, and all of a sudden that has dried up. It's gone. However, it was not to be. With no funds forthcoming from Robert C. Christian, his colleagues, or anyone else, in August of 2022, the Elbert County Board of Commissioners voted to donate the remains of the Georgia Guidestones to the Elberton Granite Association and the land on which they stood to its original owner, Wayne Mullenix. And while many have expressed hope that the Georgia Guidestones would one day stand again, 3 years on from their explosive end, this looks increasingly unlikely. As for the elusive and enigmatic Robert C. Christian who started this whole saga, the truth of his identity and that of a small group of loyal Americans he represented will likely go to the grave with his closest confidant, Baker Wyatt Martin. People ask, isn't it hard being the only one left alive who knows who he really was? They could put a gun to my head and kill me. I will never reveal his real name. In my age and my profession, you stuck by a promise of confidentiality. Last year, I went with a few friends over to an old bridge on Lake Oconee, and we dumped all correspondence associated with the Guidestones into a metal barrel and burned them. Then we poured the ashes into the lake. It'll never be known, and that's what he wanted. He always said, if you want to keep people interested, you can let them know only so much. Whoever he was, though, one can't help but wonder how feasible his grandiose vision was. For if the Georgia Guidestones were so divisive for a society that shares the same culture and language, what chance did they have of uniting a post-apocalyptic humanity in the distant future? As the saying goes, the game of golf is a good walk spoiled. Given the nearly 40,000 golf courses currently in use around the world, a great many people would probably beg to differ, but even the most enthusiastic golfer has at one time or another agreed with this sentiment when faced with the greatest of frustrations, the tedious and often futile search for a ball which has landed in the rough. Many solutions have been proposed for this classic course conundrum, such as painting balls with fluorescent or even glow-in-the-dark paint, all of which sadly still require the use of that most unreliable of instruments, the Mark I eyeball. But this is the 21st century. Surely, among all the advanced technologies at our disposal lies an elegant and convenient method of locating a lost golf ball. For example, some have proposed a tiny radio transmitter. But while this is technically feasible, not only would such a device likely be prohibitively expensive, but making a transmitter robust enough to survive the extreme forces of a golf club stroke would be a major engineering challenge. But what about something simpler, using another form of invisible energy? What about a radioactive golf ball, one that can easily be tracked down using an inexpensive Geiger counter? What could go wrong? And on top of that, surely utilizing ionizing radiation would also improve performance, for reasons we guess. So here now is the bizarre story of the radioactive golf balls. Strangely, radioactive golf balls actually predate the development of practical, portable radiation detectors. Though the basic instrument we now know as the Geiger counter was invented in 1908 by German physicist Hans Geiger, it wasn't until 1928 that he and PhD student Walther Mueller perfected the design, and not until the 1940s that practical versions became commercially available. Yet in 1910, the Worthington Golf Ball Company of Ohio began marketing the radio golf ball, featuring a core laced with 4 nanocuries of radioactive radium-226. 6 years later, in 1916, inventor Ellis Miller of the Radium Golf Ball Company of New York City applied for and was later granted U.S. patent 1,260,788 for a golf ball containing, to quote, a radioactive substance or mixture such, for example, as uranium, mineral, or ore, e.g. pitchblende, or the intensely radioactive bodies known as radium, polonium, actinium, mesothorium, and the like. Radio golf balls sold for $1 each, about $21 in today's money, and were widely advertised in various magazines and newspapers, as well as in Wanamaker's department store as the ball of mystery that never loses life or shape due to its inherent radioactive properties. Yet given the lack of commercially available radiation detectors, the radium filling was intended not to aid in locating the balls, but rather to improve their performance. As one Wanamaker's ad from the period breathlessly claims, golfers need not be alarmed. You won't need to lengthen your links because the radio ball carries so far. A writer from the New York Tribune suggests that if we keep lengthening the distance of radio golf balls, it will be necessary to lengthen golf courses, and he suggests that golf balls be standardized. We can lengthen the distance of the radio ball, but we won't. It would make the ball too expensive. It isn't necessary anyhow. It is already the most talked of golf ball. Every player who has used the radio has been thrilled and mystified by its extraordinary length from the tee, and in paradoxical combination with this, its consistent reliability on the green. The same ad features a testimonial from one of the greatest American golfers who conveniently cannot be named because, we quote without his consent or knowledge, "Last summer in the Western Championship, I found myself uncertain in my putting and again in the middle of a game. I tried a ball that had what is known as a radium center. Never have I had a ball that I could hit with the same degree of confidence. There was never a ball that could travel further, and even the old gutta, Percha ball, could not have been more reliable on the green." Well, as we shall see later, there is some circumstantial evidence that irradiating golf balls can alter their behavior. In the 1920s, the radio golf ball's purported performance was ascribed to various pseudoscientific explanations, such as, when the ball is hit, the radium salts in the plastic center start a wave of momentum which gives a great resiliency. The ball literally is alive and the released energy actually fights to free itself. In reality, however, the radio golf ball was not based on any hard science or rigorous experimentation. Rather, it was one of many products to come out of the early 20th century radium craze, kicked off by Polish-French physicist Marie Curie's discovery of the radioactive element radium in 1898. Believing that this mysterious, invisible energy source had miraculous healing powers, unscrupulous entrepreneurs inserted radium into all manner of consumer products. Some applications were legitimately useful. For example, Madame Curie herself pioneered the use of radium for irradiating and treating various cancers. Radium was also mixed with phosphors like zinc sulfide and produced self-luminous paint for clocks, watches, aircraft instruments, compasses, and other devices. Others, however, were far more dubious and often downright dangerous, with radium, uranium, thorium, and other radioactive elements finding their way into products as diverse as spark plugs, cosmetics, clothing, emanators for irradiating drinking water, condoms, quack medicines like pills and health tonics, and of course, golf balls. Some of these products thankfully contain no radioactive material at all, the radium branding being merely a marketing gimmick similar to today branding everything targeted at men as tactical, and anything in the software space is AI powered, while others contained enough radium or other elements to be deadly. Fast forward to the 1950s and the dawn of the atomic age, with portable radiation detectors newly available on the consumer market, it wasn't long before someone applied this technology to the game of golf. In 1950, American nuclear physicist William Davidson, working at the B.F. Goodrich Research Center in Brecksville, Ohio, introduced what he called the answer to the Duffer's Prayer: golf balls containing tiny pellets of radioactive cobalt-60. In June of that year, Davidson invited various well-known golfers, including Denny Shute, Jimmy Thompson, and Lawson Little, to try out his invention at the Portage Country Club in Akron. According to a March 1951 article in Mechanics Illustrated, the radioactive balls were a stunning success. The caddies' Geiger counters unerringly detected the hiding places of balls driven deep into the jungle. In a classic case of 1950s being 1950s, the same article also features a photo of the bow-tied and bespectacled Davidson demonstrating the balls to a group of women with the line, giving the fairer sex a chance to marvel at modern science. No doubt they were extremely impressed by his radioactive balls. But while B.F. Goodrich chose not to pursue a line of radioactive golf balls, this did not stop others from taking a crack at the idea. As Time magazine reported in an August the 15th, 1955 article, in one of his gloomier moments, poet T.S. Eliot predicted that Western civilization's sole enduring monuments would be the asphalt road and 1,000 lost golf balls. Not if Bart Leiper of Gatlinburg, Tennessee has his way. Leiper, a drum beater for the local Chamber of Commerce, needed a gimmick to promote the opening of Gatlinburg's new Pigeon Forge golf course and hit on a surefire teaser: atomic golf balls. At nearby Oak Ridge, he persuaded scientists to inject 3 golf balls with pellets of radioactive cobalt-60, happily headed home to Gatlinburg with his fixings. On opening day last week, as Miss Gatlinburg of 1955 posed prettily on her first tee, a blindfolded caddy, toting a borrowed Geiger counter, demonstrated that a radioactive golf ball could be found no matter how deep the grass or how dense the bushes off the fairway. However, this seemingly simple and elegant solution to one of golf's oldest problems ultimately failed to catch on for a variety of reasons. For example, at the time, nearly all radioactive material was regulated by the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, today the Department of Energy, meaning any company wanting to manufacture radioactive golf balls would have had to obtain an AEC license to acquire and use the required cobalt-60. And even then, the golf balls would have cost up to $35 each, or about $350 in today's money, making them, in the words of Time magazine, too expensive for any but the best-heeled wastelanders. There was also the problem that then, as now, few ordinary people own Geiger counters, and while lower-end models could be purchased for around $25, these were not very sensitive, while higher-end models could cost up to $700, more than $7,000 in today's money. Even then, the maximum detection range that could practically be achieved was only 1.5 meters, or 5 feet, well within easy visual range. The key limitation was the penetrating power of the 3 most common types of radiation. Some radioisotopes, like uranium and thorium, decay via alpha emission, releasing an alpha particle comprising 2 protons and 2 neutrons. However, alpha particles have very low penetrating power and can be blocked by just a few centimeters of air, making them unsuitable for long-range detection. Furthermore, Geiger counter detector tubes must be fitted with a special thin mica window to even allow alpha particles to enter and be detected. Other radioisotopes, like cobalt-60, decay via beta emission, releasing a beta particle or electron. These are more penetrating than alpha particles, but are still mostly filtered out after just a few meters travel through air. Cobalt-60 also emits significant amounts of gamma rays, electromagnetic waves with frequencies above 30 exahertz or wavelengths under 10 picometers, and that apparently can also help you Hulk out. These are most penetrating of all, only capable of being blocked by thick lead, steel, or concrete shielding. This would seem to make this isotope perfect for long-range detection. However, To be detected at ranges over 1.5 meters, a golf ball would have to contain a truly dangerous amount of cobalt-60. Indeed, the specific activity of this isotope is 1.1 kilocuries per gram, with 1 gram delivering a dose rate of around 15 sieverts per hour at a distance of 1 meter from the source, enough to deliver a lethal dose within just a few minutes. Indeed, early reports on radioactive golf balls, which contain only around 1 microgram or 1 millicurie of cobalt-60, warn golfers to not carry them in their pockets for more than 3 hours per week to avoid excessively irradiating their own balls. But while remotely locatable radioactive golf balls never caught on, this was far from the last time the seemingly unrelated fields of golf and nuclear physics would intersect. For example, in the early 1960s, a firm, Oak Ridge Atom Industries of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, began selling so-called energized golf balls, which, according to company advertisements, are treated with a special gamma energizing process that guarantees over 95% compression. No other USA-made ball does that. The energized steel center gives it greater distance and professional quality, the tough cover Longo wear gives an all-around livelier performance, and it putts well too. Oak Ridge Atom Industries was founded by one Clarence J. Spees, who at some point in the mid-1950s encountered difficulty getting grass to grow on a hillside on his property. He thus sought out the advice of Dr. Marshall Brewster, head of the medical division of the Oak Ridge Institute of Nuclear Studies. During the Second World War, this had been a key site for the Manhattan Project, producing all the enriched uranium used in the construction of the Little Boy atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Dr. Bruce suggested that he expose seeds to gamma radiation, inducing genetic mutations and hopefully producing a hardier strain of grass. This advice inspired Spees, along with Dr. Ralph T. Overman, to found one of the first commercial gamma irradiation services in the United States, headquartered on a 300-acre farm in Patchwood near Oak Ridge. Officially incorporated in 1960, Oak Ridge Atom Industries operated a 10-curie cobalt-60 source housed in a 360-kilogram or 800-pound lead shield, which they used to irradiate various products such as atom-blasted seeds for various plants and energized potting soil. And in 1964, the company introduced its most famous product, the energized golf ball, which sold for $2.25 a piece, around $23 in today's money. But these balls only remained on the market for around 4 years, after which they moved to new headquarters in Louisville, Kentucky, and focused on the irradiation of blueberries and other fruits. However, the company struggled to stay afloat and filed for bankruptcy in 1972. Who could have seen that coming? The next organization to take a swing at irradiated golf balls was Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, or AECL, the crown corporation responsible for nuclear research in Canada. In the mid-1990s, AECL's White Shell Laboratories in Pinawa, Manitoba began selling golf balls irradiated with around 300 kilorads of electrons in the laboratory's 10 million volt Impella particle accelerator. Conceived as a publicity stunt to promote AECL's research and demonstrate the safety of food irradiation, the balls were handed out as souvenirs at the 1995 G7 summit in Halifax, Nova Scotia. White Shell Laboratories also operated a service whereby, for only $30, anyone in the world could mail a dozen golf balls in for irradiation in the Impella accelerator. According to AECL spokesman Larry Shuchuk, at its height, this service irradiated up to 7,000 golf balls a year for clients as far afield as Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, and the Middle East. Around the same time, MDS Nordion, a private company headquartered in Ottawa, Ontario, ran a similar promotion with golf balls irradiated with gamma rays from a cobalt-60 source. But while the packaging for these balls claimed that they could be hit 10% farther than their non-irradiated brethren, as Shuchuk also explained, we make no claims it will work, that would take study, and we don't intend to study it. Instead, AECL staged a non-scientific demonstration in Saskatchewan for a number of pro and amateur golfers, including beloved Canadian newscaster Peter Mansbridge. Given 12 regular and 12 irradiated balls in a blind test, the participants consistently reported the irradiated balls performed better, with Mansbridge claiming, "It went 240 to 250 yards, which is about 10% farther than I normally get. However, it doesn't help me putt any better or stop me from slicing." Other golfers were more skeptical. For example, Pat Blythe, an employee and avid golfer at the White Shell Laboratories Public Information Office, stated that, "They didn't seem to help me. I just hit it in the water or the woods. I leave mine in the bag now. I guess I swing too hard trying to hit it a long ways. While Toshi Yanahara, a member of the Culture and Informational Branch of Japanese Embassy in Ottawa, reported that I used them twice and I didn't find any difference. But even if the effectiveness of irradiated golf balls has never been scientifically demonstrated, is it possible that the technique actually works? Well, yes, actually, theoretically. As this patent filed by Spalding Sports explains, the golf balls of the present invention preferably are cross-linked by irradiation, and more preferably by light rays such as gamma rays or UV radiation. Furthermore, other forms of particle irradiation, including electron beam, also can be used. Gamma radiation is preferred as golf balls or game balls can be irradiated in bulk. Gamma penetrates very deep, but also increases cross-linking of the inner core, and the compression of the core has to be adjusted to allow for the increase in hardness. Electron beam techniques are faster, but cannot be used for treating in bulk as the electron beam does not penetrate very deep. The type of irradiation to be used will depend in part upon the underlying layers. For example, certain types of irradiation may degrade windings in a wound golf ball. On the other hand, balls with a solid core would not be subject to the same concerns. Generally, a wide range of dosage levels may be used. For example, total dosages of up to 12.5 or even 15 megarads may be employed. Preferably, radiation delivery levels are controlled so that the game ball is not heated above 80 degrees Celsius or 176 degrees Fahrenheit while being cross-linked. But even if the technique does work, unfortunately, irradiated golf balls are no longer produced, and original examples from the 1960s and 1990s are now rare and expensive collector's items. And going back to our original problem of finding lost golf balls at long distances, this has actually been solved using much safer, non-nuclear technology. Several companies, including Titleist, RF Golf, and Topgolf, either sell or make extensive use of golf balls with embedded RFID chips. The same technology used in anti-theft tags in stores, these receive radio signals from a handheld transmitter and transmit them back. They thus require no internal power source, with all the radio energy being supplied by the external transmitter. This would theoretically make for an elegant, robust, and inexpensive solution to this most first world of first world problems. So why then do such balls not line the shelves of most pro shops? Well, one reason is surprisingly cost. Despite the inherent simplicity of the technology, RFID golf balls still cost on average $10 to $12 each, and the proprietary radio transmitter receivers upwards of $200, making them little more than extravagant gadgets for particularly well-heeled golfers. There is also the fact that U.S. Golf Association, or USGA, rules prohibit the use of golf balls containing data collecting devices in official tournaments. But perhaps the main reason trackable golf balls have failed to catch on is the simplest and most insidious: profit. Nearly half of all golf balls sold are ultimately lost, driving huge sale volumes for golf ball manufacturers. Indeed, this is one of the major reasons why B.F. Goodrich chose not to pursue radioactive golf balls in the 1950s. That and, the threat of reducing the world's population of golfers by irradiating their parents' gonads. And in any case, there is, of course, a far simpler and cheaper way of keeping track of your golf balls. Just keep them on the fairway, dude.